So last class we were discussing the problems with utilitarianism, and what we had said is that utilitarianism seems to face two major problems. And one of those problems is that it doesn't seem to do a very good job of making room for basic natural rights that we have. Another significant problem with utilitarianism, as I said, is that even if it could, by some force of miracle you might say, make room for rights, it doesn't seem to protect rights for the right kind of reason. And what we want to do today is we're going to look at another theory of ethics, another moral theory, that tries to do a much better job of making sense of these kinds of fundamental natural rights that we typically assume that we have. Like I said last class, these kinds of rights are going to be things like life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Now, there are many, many other kinds of natural rights, and these are more fundamental than just strictly legal rights that we might have. Legal rights are kinds of things that we have just because the government has said that we have them. Things like the right to bear arms, for instance. But the natural rights are ones that we should have independently of what the government provides us. And the government, in fact, doesn't grant us these rights. Rather, when we talk about natural rights, these are rights we have independently of society or independently of the government, and what the government does at most is simply recognize these rights which already exist. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at the philosophy of a man by the name of Immanuel Kant. And Immanuel Kant is easily one of the most famous philosophers to have ever lived. He made major contributions in a number of areas of philosophy, and the contributions that he made, you can see he lived quite a while ago, the contributions he made have still had a lasting influence to the present day. In fact, there are many people now who still consider themselves to be Kantians. He made contributions in, for instance, the field known as epistemology, which is theory of knowledge. Another field known as metaphysics. He made major contributions there as well. What he is probably most regarded for today, however, are the contributions that he made in ethics. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at Immanuel Kant's theory. Now, Kant is a very difficult writer. I didn't assign you to read any of his writings because people say he originally wrote in German, but people say that Kant's work is in German no matter what language you read it in. It's just notoriously dense and difficult. And a lot of times he introduces his own unique terminology and doesn't define it very well, which makes understanding Kant that much more difficult. But what I'm going to try to do is, best I can, break down Kant's philosophy. And we're going to begin by just talking a little bit about some basic ideas of his moral theory. And for Kant, the way he conceives of morality is he thinks of morality as consisting as a system of laws, do's and do-nots. And what he ultimately wants to do is, and we'll talk about this later on, is he's looking for a kind of supreme principle of morality, as he calls it. What we're going to call it is what we've been referring to as a moral principle. The utilitarians had their own moral principle. You might recall the principle of utility. Kant's going to derive his own version of what he thinks the supreme principle of morality is. And he thinks that these kinds of rules that exist, the moral rules that exist, they're unconditional restrictions on how we may act. For Kant, you can't violate a moral rule. If something is wrong, you can never violate it, no matter what. Furthermore, and this is probably what is, I wouldn't say most distinctive, but when people like Kant's philosophy, it's this next and final part that they like most, is that for Kant, he says that just in virtue of being a person, and for no other reason, not because you have an important place in society, not because you're a man or a woman, not for any kind of arbitrary reason, not because of your class distinction, nothing like that, but just in virtue of being a person, you have a certain kind of inherent dignity and inherent worth that can't be stripped away from you. And for that reason, just because you're a person, you deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. And so for Kant, respect for persons is going to be a fundamental driving force in his ethical theory. And we'll see exactly how that works out later on. Now, what I want to do is try to unpack Kant's moral philosophy a little bit and guide you into it. And Kant begins by making an observation about the nature of moral obligations. And the very first thing he says, and I was indicating this a second ago, is that he says that morality places unconditional restrictions on our actions. Now, what this basically means is just this, think of like a moral rule, like do not murder. What Kant says is that this is, because it's a moral rule, this is something you can never violate no matter what. Now, certainly people do violate it, but you can't just walk away from it. When you violate this rule, you've always done something wrong for Kant. And I'll try to help add some clarity to this by contrasting it with other kinds of restrictions that we have, or other kind of rules which we are guided by. So for instance, for this particular class you're taking, you have to write a paper, take a couple of exams. Those are things that you should do for this class. We can say you ought to do those. You're required to do those. But here's the thing. You can back out of those obligations if you want. All you have to do is drop the class. And if you drop the class, you're no longer bound to do those things. You're no longer required. But morality doesn't work that way. You can't just simply choose to back out of whatever moral obligations are upon you. If you're bound by a moral rule, you always have to adhere to that rule, no matter what. If I were to meet you on the street and I said, hey, I didn't receive your paper, and you said, yeah, some things got in my way, some circumstances came up and I had to drop the class, I would say, okay, I understand. You can get out of that obligation to write the paper just by dropping the class. But if you murdered somebody and you were on trial for that, you couldn't say, yeah, I just decided that rule didn't apply to me anymore, so I was going to back out of that. Or that's just not how morality works. Morality places, like I said, unconditional restrictions on how we may act. So this is number one, and this might seem a very obvious thing, but it's going to have really important implications later on. Secondly, Kant really focuses very heavily on our duties. And Kant asks a question which is simple enough, and he asks, what is it that makes an action truly good? Is it enough, for instance, that I simply obey my duties, or do I also have to obey my duties for the right reason? Now, think about this for Kant. What he's basically asking is something truly good if you simply do the right thing? Or do you, in order for something to truly be good, must you also do the right thing for the right reason? This is what Kant is asking. And he provides an example designed to demonstrate that it's not sufficient to do something that's truly merit-worthy. It's not sufficient to just do the right thing. You also have to do it for the right reason. And the example Kant provides is that of an honest shopkeeper, or we might say an honest business owner. So suppose somebody never he's got a business or she's got a business, and they never ever cheat their customers, no matter what. And now, they're doing the right thing, but is it truly good? This is what Kant wants to ask. And in asking this question, notice that I'm drawing a distinction between doing something that is right and doing something that is good. And what Kant is going to say is that you can do something that's right, but that doesn't necessarily make it truly good. And truly, not to say that it necessarily makes it bad, but Kant draws a distinction here between something that's really and truly good versus something that's just, you might say, merely good. But let's go back to the example. And imagine there's a shopkeeper who never cheats his customers no matter what. Have they done something that's truly meritorious? And what Kant is going to say is, well, that really depends. That depends on the reason why they did it. So, for instance, suppose there's shopkeeper number one. And let's say he never cheats his customers no matter what. But the reason shopkeeper number one never cheats his customers is simply because he thinks that it might be bad for business. Why might it be bad for business? Well, suppose that he did sometimes cheat his customers, and it got out that he cheated his customers. Well, then he would have a reputation of being a cheat, and people may not want to do business with him. So shopkeeper number one, the only reason he doesn't cheat you is because he thinks it would be bad for himself in the long run. Now compare that with shopkeeper number two. And let's suppose shopkeeper number two never cheats his customers. And the reason he never cheats his customers is simply because he thinks that you should not do that to people. That customers deserve to be treated better. That they deserve to be treated with a certain kind of dignity and respect. Now, based on that example, ask yourself, has shopkeeper number 1 and shopkeeper number 2, they've both done the right thing. That is, they haven't cheated their customers. But is there a moral difference at all between their two actions? And it seems like there is. For shopkeeper number 1, yeah, he's done something that's right, and you might even say that it's good to some level. He hasn't done something that's bad, certainly, but in the second case, with shopkeeper number 2, his action truly seems like is worth merit. It's truly good, you might say. And so Kant, what he's pointing to here is that in order to do something that's really praiseworthy, you have to have the right motive and not simply do the right thing. Or here's an example of my own. Suppose that I have an uncle, and let's suppose that my uncle is getting sick. He's aging, he's getting a little bit older, and so I decide to go and try to help take care of him as he ages. Now that seems like I'm doing the right thing, but am I doing something that's truly good, you might ask? Suppose my reason for helping my uncle is simply because he happens to be extremely wealthy, and I know that there are no other apparent heirs to his fortune, and so I go to help him out as he gets sick with the hopes that he might place me in his will and I can inherit his money. Now, some of you might find that very despicable, but notice that I'm still helping him. He's still getting care. Now contrast that. Suppose that my uncle is rich and I go help him, but I don't care at all about his money. I'm just there because I care about my uncle, and I recognize that it's the right thing to do to help someone, or my sick uncle, as he ages and gets worse off. Now, even in the first case, I'm still doing the right thing. I'm helping him out. But it's only in the second case that Kant would say I'm doing something that's truly good, that's truly praiseworthy. And this is really important for Kant. And here he draws an important distinction between what he says is acting for the sake of duty as opposed to simply acting in accordance with duty. And we can better understand this distinction in the following way. To act for the sake of duty means I'm doing something because I recognize that it's the right thing to do. So the first one I have listed up here, to act for the sake of duty, that's the one that's truly praiseworthy right here. To act for the sake of duty, that is for Kant, to do the right thing for the right reason. Whereas the second one, to act merely in accordance with duty, think about it. I'm acting merely in accordance. I'm just doing the duty. My actions are aligned with duty, but not necessarily my reasons or my motives. I'm not doing the right thing for the right reason. Now, Kant regards both of these as, to some extent, good. He wouldn't say that if you act in accordance with duty that you've done something bad, but it's really and truly only the first one that's truly of moral praise and truly worthy of moral praise. And Kant places a huge amount of emphasis on the role of duty. And the reason Kant does, he places so much emphasis on this, at least in part, is because he says it's only when we act for duty that we can always be guided and do the right thing. If you act, for instance, out of selfish ambition, sometimes that might lead you astray and you might do the wrong thing. If you act for the consequences, like the utilitarian was motivated by consequences. Sometimes that can lead you to do the wrong thing. Likewise, even if you act out of love, you try to do something out of love. For Kant, he says that can sometimes lead you to do something that's immoral. Maybe you would steal or cheat or kill for someone you love. I don't know if you guys keep up with Game of Thrones, for instance, but Jaime Lannister, he loves his sister and he does all kinds of immoral things for her. Likewise, his sister, Cersei, she loves her children and does all kinds of immoral things because she's guided by her love for her children. But Kant says that, selfish ambition, to act for consequences, to act even out of love, those kinds of things, they don't necessarily provide 100% guarantee that you're going to end up doing the right things. It's only when you act for the sake of duty that you will always do the right thing, that your actions will always be morally right. And so this is another part of the reason why Kant places so much emphasis and so much worth on acting for the sake of duty and not merely acting simply in accordance with duty. And I want to just kind of make sure that we understand this and give you a few examples just so you can better understand what is going on here. And imagine this scenario occurs. Suppose I help an elderly lady cross the road. For Kant, did I do something that you might say was truly good? My question here is a bit misleading. Did I do the right thing? Yes. But did I do something that's truly good for Kant? Well, hopefully you know enough to know now that that depends. Why did you do it? Why did you help the elderly lady cross the road? Were you trying to benefit from it in some way? Were you trying to get something out of it? Were you even doing it out of love? If you said yes to any of those, then what you did wasn't truly good. The only reason that Kant thinks that you can have that would lead you to do something that's truly good is if you did it from a brute recognition that it's your duty and you must obey the moral rules. You must do your duty, as Kant would say, for the reason that it is your duty to do it. Here's another good question right here. Suppose I find out a person is down and out on their luck and I buy their car at well under market value. For Kant, did I do something that is, did I do the right thing? We could ask, and did I do something that's truly good? We can further ask still. Now, this is an interesting question for a lot of reasons, because you might think, well, look, suppose you find out, for instance, let me make this a little more specific, a little less abstract. Suppose somebody is selling a car, right? And their car is worth $10,000, and you go in and you say, hey, I'll give you $2,000 for the car, and you know that the person is down and out on their luck. If they don't get the $2,000, they're going to be kicked out of their house. They're going to lose everything. So you offer them $2,000. Did you do something that was truly good? And did you do something that we could even ask if it's right? Did you do something that was immoral, you might ask? Well, this is a really good question. And you might initially think, yeah, you did something wrong. You took advantage of this person. But what Kant is going to say is it really depends largely on what your motive was and why you did what you did. So suppose that, again, someone is down and out on their luck. They're about to be homeless unless they can sell their car. They're asking $10,000. Their car is worth $10,000, and you offer them $2,000. Well, suppose though it depends on the situation. So suppose you go in and you know this about them, and you think they're asking $10,000, but I'm going to screw them over because they have to take this, or they're going to be kicked out on the street. So they don't have to take any offer I throw at them. So you throw $2,000 at them, and you say, "Will you take this?" And you know they have no choice but to take it, or they'll basically be homeless and out on the street. Well, in that case, Kant would say that you did something that was wrong. Why? Because you tried to exploit them and take advantage of them. But suppose the scenario is very similar. You hear the person's down and out on their luck. You go and talk to them. And what you tell them is say, hey, look, I don't have $10,000. I can't afford your car. And they say, well, what do you have? And you say something like, well, all I have is $2,000. And then they say, hey, I'll take it. And you maybe even respond back to them and say, no, that's not fair. That's not a good price for your car. You could probably do better. But suppose that they keep pressing you and they say, no, this would help me out. And so I mention this because you can see here how your motives might be very, very different in what you're trying to do. Someone who's trying to screw them out of their money, for Kant, they would do something bad. Whereas someone who wasn't trying to screw them out of their money necessarily, but was trying to help them, and the best they could offer in terms of help was to buy the car for $2,000, for Kant, in that case, they would do something that's not only right, but truly good. And this is so important because what it highlights and what it demonstrates here is that two actions, they might be identical when viewed from the outside. Buying someone's car for $2,000 in the first case where you're trying to screw them versus buying someone's car for $2,000 in the second case where you're trying to help them out. Judged externally, those actions appear indistinguishable. What makes a moral difference, though, is what goes on inside, you might say. What is the motive that the person has when they're making the deal? And so this is really, really important for Kant because at the end of the day, the outcomes of your actions, these kinds of things, they don't determine the moral worth of your action. The moral worth of your action is determined solely by the reason or motive that you have when you perform the action in question. Like I said, this is very, very different from the utilitarian. For the utilitarian, all that mattered were the outcomes of your actions. For Kant, it's not the outcomes that make a moral difference. What makes the moral difference is your reason or your motive when you're acting. And Kant takes this extremely seriously. And I'm going to actually read to you a quote from Kant here. And this is a little hard to follow, but I'll try to make some sense of it. And here's what Kant says about your motive. He says this, a good will. And when he says a good will, what he means is to do the right thing for the right reason, to act in accordance. To act for the sake of duty. That's what he's referring to here. But he says a good will is good not because of what it performs or affects, not by its aptness for the attainment of some proposed end, but simply by virtue of its volition. That is, it is good in itself. Even if by a special disfavor of fortune it should achieve nothing, and there should remain only the good will, then like a jewel it will still shine by its own light, as a thing which has its whole value in itself. Its usefulness or fruitlessness can neither add to nor take anything from this value. Now, what exactly is Kant saying here? Basically, what he's saying is if you do the right thing for the right reason, even if it doesn't produce good consequences, as he says, even if it should achieve nothing and there should remain only the good will. So even if you try to do the right thing for the right reason and it achieves nothing, and the only thing that you have left is that you did the right thing for the right reason, Kant says then it would shine like a jewel by its own light, which has its whole value in itself. He goes on to say its usefulness. So no matter how useful, so even if it was, no matter how useless, no matter how fruitless, these kinds of things could not detract from the moral value of what you have done. You must do the right thing for the right reason, and for Kant, that's all that matters from a moral point of view. Now, this might seem a little extreme, because you might be thinking, wait, but we said that our actions have consequences, and those consequences matter significantly. Now, is Kant saying that the consequences of our actions don't matter at all? Because that seems really preposterous in a way, to say that when we're evaluating the morality of our actions, that we shouldn't look at the consequences. I mean, if you do something and it, like we said before, it makes someone's situation way worse off or produces terrible results, how can you say that you did the right thing? And this is kind of a complex response that Kant offers to this kind of question. And what Kant is going to say about consequences is basically this, is that they do matter in one way, and in another way, they matter only kind of in an indirect sort of fashion. So what I want to say here is just this, is first of all, what Kant is going to do is he's going to draw a distinction between what you might say is the moral worth of our action and other ways that we have of evaluating an action. And so we can evaluate any particular action along various dimensions, and we can judge the action to be good in a number of different kinds of ways. So for instance, suppose I give you some financial advice. Suppose I tell you to invest in a company, and that company later goes bankrupt, and as a result, you lose a lot of money. Now, have I done something that's immoral? Well, not necessarily. Maybe I thought the company was going to do well. I had every reason to think the company was going to do well. I was genuinely trying to help you. Well, in that case, then what I have done is not an immoral action. However, I've nonetheless given you bad financial advice. Why? Because we determine good financial advice based on whether or not the advice gives you more money in the end, whether it helps you produce more money. So what I did in that particular case is I did something that was morally okay, but financially was really bad. And so this example points out how we can evaluate any particular action in different kinds of ways. Something, for instance, might be morally okay, but a bad financial decision. Or something might be morally okay, but a bad engineering decision, or a bad educational decision, or a bad sports decision. We could evaluate the action in a lot of different ways. And so what Kant is going to say is just this, is that the moral worth of your action is only dictated by the motives or reasons that you have for doing it. Other ways of evaluating an action, those kinds of things might be determined by the consequences. Second point here is that Kant says even when we're looking at the moral worth of an action, the consequences will matter somewhat, because what consequences can do is they can enable us to figure out what a person's intention was. I mean, here's the thing. You never really know what a person's true motive or true intention is. Why? Because those kinds of things are mental and they're hidden away from other people. I can't look inside your head and know what's going on, and you can't look inside my head. So how do we figure out what a person's true motive or true intention is? Well, we have to look at their actual actions and figure out, based on their action, does the intention they're telling us they had, does that seem to line up with what seems reasonable? So let me give you an example to illustrate what I'm talking about here. So suppose, for instance, someone, they go out and they dump battery acid all over your car. And you confront them about this and you say, why did you do this? Why did you destroy my car? And they say, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize it would do that. I was trying to clean your car. I thought it would make your paint shine and glisten. Now, what Kant's going to say is, if that truly was their motivation, if that's really how they were motivated, then they haven't done something that's immoral, because they were trying to do the right thing. But here's the thing, if someone told you that, no one would buy it. No one would believe that they really and truly thought dumping battery acid all over your car would actually improve the quality of the paint. Every person of reasonable intelligence would know that dumping battery acid on your car would destroy the paint. So if their intention truly had been to make your car, to clean your car up, then morally speaking, they wouldn't have done anything wrong. However, given the consequences of their actions, and given the fact that everybody knows that their action would lead to a certain consequence, we can use that to figure out what their motive actually was. And so here you see, Kant is not saying that consequences are completely irrelevant to morality. We can use the fact that certain actions produce certain consequences to figure out what a person's true intent or true motive was. So don't walk away from this thinking that Kant says consequences are completely irrelevant. That's not what he's saying at all. So what I've said so far is just this, is that for Kant, you have to do the right thing for the right reason. You have to obey the moral rules and perform your moral duties, and you have to do them for the right reason. But here's a big question, and something that we haven't answered at this point. How do we know what the right things to do are? I have to do the right things out of a respect for the moral law. I have to do the right things for the right reason. But what are the right things that I should be doing? How do we figure these things out? And what Kant does is he wants to offer us a supreme principle of morality. And this is, again, very much like what the utilitarian tried to do. The utilitarian offered us the principle of utility. And the purpose of the principle of utility was to tell us what to do on any particular occasion. And Kant's going to provide his own principle. And he calls this principle the categorical imperative. Now, that sounds really, really fancy. The utilitarians, their supreme principle of morality, they call it the principle of utility. And it's like, okay, well, that makes sense. You're utilitarians, you have the principle of utility. You would think that Kant's principle would have a name that's, lines up more with his view, but he calls it the categorical imperative. So I remember hearing this when I first took an intro class in philosophy, and I was just really intimidated by this terminology, but it's really not that complicated once you break it down. An imperative is just something you have to do. I don't mean imperative in the sense that you might be thinking of it, but rather the sense that imperative is like, it just means that you have to do it. Categorical means always, in all cases, in all categories. So basically, this is what he's saying is that he refers to the supreme principle of morality as the imperative, a rule that you always have to follow. If he had just called it that, the rule you always have to follow, then it might have been less intimidating. But Kant's categorical imperative. Now, what is his supreme principle, of morality? It's just this. Act always to treat humanity, whether in one's own person or in that of any other, as an end in itself, and never as a mere means to an end. Now that is a mouthful. And in the next presentation, what I'm going to do in part 2, I'm going to parse this out and explain it. Because this is a little tricky. In a nutshell, basically what Kant is saying here is just this. You can never ever harm people, and sometimes you have to help people out. Now, like I said, in part 2, I'm going to explain this because there are a couple of key terms that need to be parsed out. But in a nutshell, that's all Kant is saying here.